All wrestling fans are prone to a bit of fantasy booking. Fans during the Monday Night Wars had it better than most as they all wondered and speculated and argued who would come out on top if somehow WWF and WCW ever came to blows. The Undertaker versus Sting, Austin versus Goldberg, The Rock versus DDP, DX versus the NWO. But none of these matches could ever happen because there was no world in which the two biggest companies in pro wrestling could coexist. Right? Well, lo and behold, when Vince McMahon bought out his greatest competitor in early 2001, fans sat up in excitement when the penny dropped. Even more so when it was revealed that son Shane had bought WCW and was coming to wage war on his father's empire. The apex of the hottest period in professional wrestling history. Finally, all the greatest dream matches would come true, and we were in for a hell of a ride. But instead, we got the invasion. A fumble so bad, it has gone down in wrestling history as truly one of the worst storylines ever. Now, as you can see, I am a mere 11-year-old boy and wasn't even a twinkle in my pappy's eye when the Monday Night Wars were in full swing. But speaking with my colleagues here at Cultaholic who lived through it, and they told me it's hard to grasp from a modern perspective just how big wrestling was in the late 90s and early 2000s. Then they gave me a pound coin and told me to get some sweets as a treat. Now, for all we make of WWE versus AEW in the modern era, it pales in comparison to WWF versus WCW. The industry was different, the companies themselves were different beasts, and yes, us fans were different too. While the animosity between AEW and WWE diehards is an online echo chamber of nonsensical vitriol, WCW versus WWF was two massive companies in a huge dick-swinging contest, and neither Eric Bischoff nor Vince McMahon would rest until the other was out of business. Eventually, due to a series of booking blunders, financial mismanagements, and some Viagra on a pole matches, WCW bought the farm in early 2001. You can hear all about it in Cultaholic's Rise and Fall of WCW video, which you should watch after you watch this video. So yes, McMahon bought out WCW for about 15 quid, and while the contract read McMahon, it was in fact Shane McMahon who was in control, not Vince, as Shane revealed on the last ever Monday Nitro while sporting a lovely jumper. Look at that knitwear. The stage was all set for WWF versus WCW, with a McMahon heading up each entity. As long as they stick to the sidelines and let the matches do the talking, it should be all fine. Just let the focus be on the wrestling. But the ego can be a monster if not kept in check. First of all, we had to get Vince versus Shane out of the way, with the two having a match at WrestleMania X7 that was honestly far better than it had any right to be. And oh look, WCW wrestlers were in attendance. Not doing anything, they were just sitting in a box, looking very bored. It's WrestleMania X7. Now, let's see who we've got here. Is it Scott Steiner, Rey Mysterio Jr., Ric Flair? Why no, it's Johnny Ace, Sean Stasiak, and some other geeks. The fact they were lackadaisically introduced to the WWF audience with little fanfare, never mind the fact that they were WCW wrestlers as opposed to WWF superstars, it wasn't a great opening. Coupled with the fact that it was WCW Z-listers and concerns were already to be had. It wasn't originally set to go down like this. These WCW wrestlers were at one point factored into the match and were set to interfere on behalf of new boss Shane, despite Shane being the face and Vince being heel. Plans were scrapped, however, when Sean Stasiak flapped his big meaty gums and blabbed about the spot to the press. Again, I'm going to run this AEW versus WWE rivalry as a parallel, but imagine AEW invaded WWE, but we got the Blade, Kip Sabian, and Michael Nakazawa just sat in the crowd looking bored while Nick Khan and his son hit each other with bins. Okay, that sounds like something I definitely watch, but in reality it would be terrible. The first real shot of the invasion itself came when Lance Storm ran in and superkicked Perry Saturn mid-match on an episode of Raw in May, with the crowd erupting at the sight of everyone's favourite buzz-cut sporting Canadian wobbling Perry's jaw. A week later, on June 4th, Hugh Morris would run interference to hit a moonsault on Edge as an air raid siren blared over the arena speakers, a huge WCW logo flashing on the Titantron to signal his arrival and seemingly his intent. So far, so good. But we needed some main eventers, someone to go after the big dogs in the yard and not the pups in the mid-card. Enter Diamond Dallas Page, with a multi-time WCW champion garnering one of the loudest pops you'll ever hear while unveiling himself as the stalker that had been terrorizing Undertaker's wife Sarah just to get to the head of the dead man. A couple weeks later, at King of the Ring, WCW World Heavyweight Champion Booker T would arrive to back suplex WWF Champion Steve Austin through the Spanish announce table. Just one night later, in WWF's home Madison Square Garden, Shane and Vince would have an in-ring confrontation, with Booker running in and attacking Vince before he and Shane legged it through the crowd, with WWF giving chase. To quote Jim Ross, "The battle lines have been drawn." The thing was, initially the majority of the WCW invaders were going after heels, but this was inside WWF arenas and in front of WWF fans. The same fans who for years had been told by WWF on multiple occasions, WCW is crap and full of old irrelevant wrestlers who are also crap. Outside of the initial Pavlovian surprise pop, fans were probably never going to cheer WCW over WWF's home guard, no matter whether they were face or heel. There was also the fact that in simple pro wrestling logic, if you are the one committing the initial act of unprovoked aggression, then you by all means are the heel. The audience were inevitably going to respond in the way that they'd been conditioned to since the dawn of time. The next invaders were WCW Tag Team Champions Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Haire, and despite having a strong push during WCW's death throes, they weren't exactly household names. Even worse, after Palumbo and O'Haire laid out the Hardys and the Dudleys, they were accosted and mercilessly battered by WWF A-listers. Hardcore Holly and the APA. It's not quite Taker versus Sting, was it? WWF management worked towards getting WCW Nitro a new TV deal to keep the illusion of a war alive, but no broadcaster wanted it due to the whole Nitro in late 1999 until 2001 being unwatchable thing. Plans allegedly called for Raw to be replaced by WCW Nitro, with WWF turning SmackDown into their flagship. But Raw broadcaster TNN balked at the idea, because who in 2001 would gladly cancel ratings juggernaut Raw in favour of the dead brand Nitro? Instead, WWF gave 25 minutes of Raw in Tacoma, Washington over to WCW as a proof of concept, with Booker T wrestling Buff Bagwell in an adequate WCW-style match that went down like a lead balloon. Even worse, mega main event heels Steve Austin and Kurt Angle were cheered like gods when they turned up to batter Booker and Buff Daddy. If only Raw was in a WCW city, such as Atlanta, this could have been less of a disaster. Hang on. Oh, yeah. In exactly 1 week later, they would be in Atlanta. This is not the first time in this video I'll speak about impatience. You can put money on that. Here is where the first obvious problem was. Without a neutral battlefield, or indeed without home and away fights, all skirmishes would happen on WWF turf, making them the de facto faces in the angle. No shades of grey, no intrigue, just clear as day, WWF good, WCW bad. While most feuds are perfectly fine being good versus bad, a feud of this scope and magnitude, pop, just wasn't. Further WCW segments would air on WWF TV, with Cruiserweight Champion Gregory Helms defending against Billy Kidman, and Booker putting Big Goldie on the line against DDP on SmackDown. And once again, the fans didn't really care, as for all they were concerned, these were heel versus heel matchups. So essentially, the timing was off just in so many ways. Outside of Booker and DDP, there were no main event caliber WCW stars invading the WWF. And unfortunately, DDP had been unceremoniously buried by Undertaker on every single occasion since the King of Bada Bing made his WWF arrival. You could argue that Buff Bagwell was a big name, but he was turfed out of WWF after one match for being, well, Buff Bagwell. The likes of your Hogans, your Nashes, your Goldbergs et al. Sat at home, still under lucrative Time Warner contracts. WWF weren't prepared to buy these contracts out, and the lads at home wouldn't have been in a rush to break off their deals after seeing The Undertaker absolutely pace DDP with little reply. DDP's reward for taking a chance and betting on himself. While on the WWF front, they too were little light up top, with main eventers Triple H and The Rock out due to injury and Hollywood commitments. Former WCW stars Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit were both teasing defection back to Atlanta, but were also taken off TV due to addiction issues and injury. In July, some chaos and excitement was added to the mix when ECW wound the clock back to 1997 by invading Raw once more. Now this was how you invade. As WCW stars Lance Storm and Mike Awesome were being beaten down by Kane and Chris Jericho, Rob Van Dam and Tommy Dreamer arrived to start a fight. WWF stars such as Taz, the Dudleys, Rhino, and Raven arrived to help Kane and Jericho before aligning with the fellow ECW alums as Paul Heyman left the commentary booth to say ECW was here to put everyone on notice. Seeing as ECW was the influential blueprint behind the Attitude Era, then it made sense for them to be the ones to take matters more extreme, with their grievances against the big boys more than valid. Vince and Shane would give ECW instant credibility by agreeing to put their differences aside for one night to try and fight the chaotic violence of Heyman's Mad Lads. But it was all a swerve, as ECW partnered with WCW as another middle finger to poor middle mom and pop operation that was the WWF. After the WWF lads had stood tall against WCW's forces earlier in the night. Obviously. While it could be argued that ECW and WCW teaming together to destroy the man who put them out of business was a good narrative beat, it just didn't sit right. For those of us who knew our onions, the idea of ECW and WCW being pals was as plausible as CM Punk going out on the piss, or Bret Hart cracking a smile. ECW should have remained this chaotic force of nature, fighting whomever they pleased just for the crack. But no, everything had to boil down to those mean nasty others versus the virtuous and kind WWF. Let's not forget, this was a year and change removed from the big corporation being the big heel force in the company, and now we were supposed to be sympathetic to Vince McMahon and his plight. We're also just a few months on from the putting Linda McMahon in a catatonic state so he could have relations with Trish Stratus storyline, and now we're meant to be on his side. Things would go from bad to worse when it was revealed that ECW was under new ownership, with Stephanie McMahon commanding the Philadelphia Meatheads. An official coalition was formed between Steph and brother Shane, and WCW and ECW and Paul Heyman, because we can't forget them now, can we? The few WCW and ECW diehards that remained tuning in to WWF TV would have likely turned their back right there. This was the official death knell of the whole storyline before it really got going. It was clear this storyline was yet more McMahon family bollocks, and really, who cared? Even the ardent WWF fans who tuned in every week would have been sick at the sight of Vince and his offspring, and it's no surprise that the invasion coincided with the business entering a cooler period. Cooler as in less popular. Not Scott Hall vibes. He was sat at home. While Vince had become an incredible heel in the late 90s, he was merely a foil to get Steve Austin over to astronomical levels. In no way was he the star attraction. When the focus of WWF programming was less about the in-ring talent and more about the powers that run the circus, it was far less compelling. At least WWF didn't go all WrestleMania 2000 on us, with a McMahon in every corner. God, imagine Linda McMahon coming out and like, you can't have an invasion without the proud backbone of the AWA. Ugh. Yeah, I shudder at the thought. Have Shane and Stephanie be the bankrollers of WCW and ECW, fine, but don't have them front and center. We wanted WWF versus WCW versus ECW. We didn't want Vince versus Shane and Stephanie, again, for the millionth time in 2 years. But tough titties, we were having McMahon family drama whether we wanted it or not. Imagine this was any other sport. When the AFL and the NFL first clashed in the Super Bowl, fans wanted to see which league was superior and who out of the Chiefs and the Packers would emerge victorious. They didn't give a monkeys about who was financing each franchise. Unless you've been living under a rock, the ego of the McMahon family is no secret, but this was probably the most egregious public display of their own inflated sense of self-worth in company history. From the simulcast Raw Nitro in April 2001 that saw Vince basically spend 4 hours of combined network television saying he was amazing and had a massive knob, to the most exciting angle of a generation basically being tossed aside to give us more of the same. And this was merely the beginning. WWF would promote the first and only Invasion pay-per-view for July 22nd, 2001 in Cleveland. And to be fair, it was easy to ignore the missteps taken in the angle to get genuinely excited by a dream show we'd all, well, dreamed of. We were finally getting a full WWF versus WCW and ECW card, and even lapsed fans would have been eager to see how it played out. The main beat going into the Invasion concerned WWF champion Stone Cold Steve Austin. Austin was in his heel run after aligning with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania X7 and had entered his soft-edged kumbaya phase, and Vince needed him kicking asses once again heading into this show. On the go-home, Austin did just that, single-handedly laying waste to the entirety of the invading forces with a pull cue and stunners. Not quite a burial, but certainly didn't do the WCW and ECW coalition any favours. Now, let's take a look at the poster for the show. Of course, it's a picture of Vince and Shane. The opening video package of the show was footage of World War II interspersed with Vince, Shane, and Stephanie. And if you squint your eyes, you might see Booker T. I think it's about time we go through the card, shall we? So, Edge and Christian beat Lance Storm and Mike Awesome in a solid opener. Earl Hebner defeated Nick Patrick. I'd rather voluntarily put my face up Rikishi's arse than think about this match, honestly. Two shrinking violets trying to get themselves over as per usual. Mick Foley refed this one. People in the crowd actually had pro Earl signs. And honestly, I hope these marks were banned from future events. WWF Tag Champs APA beat WCW Tag Champs Palumbo and O'Hare to surprise, well, no one. WCW Cruiserweight Champion Billy Kidman defeated WWF Light Heavyweight Champion X-Pac, with Pac being the only WWF star booed because of the fabled X-Pac heat. Raven defeated William Regal. It was okay, but hardly the first match you think of for WWF versus ECW. Kanyon, Hugh Morris, and Sean Stasiak defeated Billy Gunn, Albert, and Big Show in a battle of "We've got nothing for you. Go fill 5 minutes." Tajiri beat Taz to show just how far the human suplex machine star had actually fallen at this point. RVD defeated Jeff Hardy for the Hardcore title in honestly a great match. RVD was cheered like a king because it was RVD in 2001, prime. Trish Stratus and Lita defeated Stacy Keibler and Tori Wilson in a bra and panties match because again, it was 2001. Then, in the main event, WCW and ECW's DDP, Booker T, the Dudleys, Rhino defeated Team WWF's The Undertaker, Kane, Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and Steve Austin. Because Austin turned on Angle and the WWF. The fact that WCW/ECW only won the night due to Steve Austin can be subtly chalked up to a WWF win, really, can't it? Woe betide DDP getting some heat back by getting a clean win, or Booker being cemented as a star with a definitive victory. Hell, let the Dudleys get the pin. They were already WWF stars beforehand. But no, the only way WCW or ECW won was due to WWF's biggest star, and that's the bottom line. In between every match at Invasion, there was a segment involving one of the McMahons, as well as a bit in WWF New York of Hardcore Holly ripping a WCW shirt off a fan because he's a giant mark. Yeah, I said it. Come at me, you big bullying bastard. Overall, Invasion is not a very good pay-per-view, but definitely worth checking out for anyone curious. Regardless of its perceived quality, it did gangbusters for the WWF and was the second most bought pay-per-view of the year behind only WrestleMania 17. The public were keen for a proper crossover, and WWF had an open goal. But it was already too little, too late. If there was even the slightest inkling or hope that McMahon would change the story beats and give us a proper WWF versus WCW feud, the number of buys for Invasion would have been all the ammo he needed to prove he was on to a winner. So now the biggest star of WCW/ECW's alliance was Stone Cold Steve Austin. While we all know that Austin was formerly part of both WCW and ECW, he was the main star of WWF's hottest period ever, and his explanation of "I didn't feel valued" was wishy-washy at best. This is the man who wasn't valued by WCW in the first place. That was the problem. Remember how we said ECW should have been a chaotic force of nature bound to no loyalties? The same should have gone for Austin, like he had always been. Just let him put the WWF Championship on the line against any sumbitch from any company. But no, he was now the main star of WCW and ECW because he wanted to feel loved. WWF therefore needed a new hero to lead the charge. While Kurt Angle had been groomed for the position, we were only a few weeks removed from him wearing his adorable little cowboy hat, so his character needed a little rehabbing. He did beat Booker for the big Goldie on SmackDown after the pay-per-view, and then lost it back to Booker on the following Raw, again due to Steve Austin. Let Booker win clean, please. At least this victory made him a five-time. But never mind that. Here comes The Rock, appearing for the first time since the Raw after Mania 17. Both the Alliance and the WWF had made a play for his services, but Rocky decided to side with his home team, which made sense, despite the fact that the last time we saw him, Vince McMahon betrayed him and cost him the WWF Championship. Suppose we just had to get to Austin versus Rock again though. And Austin versus Vince. Heading into SummerSlam, tensions between the two sides continued. Titles changed hands across companies and major defections took place. Did former WCW or ECW stars such as Jericho or Big Show cross back over, building on intrigue held by long-term fans? No. Instead, Test did, despite the fact that no one really ever cared about Test. He never worked anywhere but WWF, and the fact that in kayfabe he hated Shane and Stephanie McMahon. But he was dead tall, so obviously he got a push. Further defections would come at SummerSlam, when Christian would turn his back on Edge and would later join the Alliance to really twist the knife into his brother. Whilst the tag breakup was simmering between the two, did Christian really have to join forces with two companies he'd never worked for? Despite WWF having the pick of WCW and ECW at their disposal, they clearly favoured the stars that had locked in contracts before buying out their competition. And whilst I understand the reasoning behind it, it just wasn't exciting and was glaringly obvious. SummerSlam itself, it was all Alliance versus WWF matches, bar one. But on the main card, the only stars that wrestled that weren't already part of the WWF beforehand were Lance Storm, RVD, DDP, Kanyon, and Booker T. Out of that list, only RVD would notch up a win. Storm dropped the IC title to Edge, DDP and Kanyon got battered mercilessly by the Brothers of Destruction for the WWF and WCW tag titles, and Booker dropped Big Goldie to The Rock, clean as a whistle. The one SummerSlam match that was WWF versus WWF saw X-Pac defeat Tajiri to land the WCW Cruiserweight and WWF Light Heavyweight Championships. Jesus Christ, they had one job. They literally had one job. With Rock as WCW champion and Austin as WWF champion, it looked like a unification could be on the cards. However, the two were kept separate and carried on fighting their own battles. Rock would tangle a little with Chris Jericho and Booker T, while Austin and Kurt Angle continued to beef. Heavy hitters such as William Regal, Ivory, and Stevie Richards would defect to the Alliance, the latter bringing Chronic with him. Haha, Chronic. Bryan Adams and Clark. Former Fed guys as Crush and Adam Bomb, they'd surely slot back into things and readapt to the WWF style when taking on their old mates Undertaker and Kane in tag team action. Except they didn't. Their match at Unforgiven stunk so much it almost made me long for Earl Hebner versus Nick Patrick, and was so bad that Adams and Clark were never seen again. Still, why were they not brought in earlier? Have them invade rather than Palumbo and O'Hare because, while they may have been as much use as a chocolate teapot in the ring, they were big, recognizable grizzly bastards who could have just wrecked shop. When they eventually did arrive to batter Taker, they got a huge pop from the crowd. What else happened at Unforgiven, I hear you ask? Well, in the biggest WCW's crap move, WCW champion The Rock defeated Booker T and Shane McMahon clean as a whistle in a handicap match. God, this company, man. Anyway, let's move on. WWF, for their efforts, received Chuck Palumbo and Torrie Wilson as defectors. Hooray for them, I guess. No Mercy was up next. 6 previously non-WWF wrestlers were on the main card. All of them lost apart from Torrie Wilson, and she was Team WWF anyway, so that doesn't count. Edge defeated Christian in a good ladder match. Chris Jericho defeated The Rock for Big Goldie, but the focus was on Stephanie McMahon trying to interfere. And Rob Van Dam's organic rise up the card saw him challenge WWF champion Stone Cold and Kurt Angle in a triple threat match. Decent match, but again, the focus was of course on Vince and Shane having a fist fight at ringside. As we marched on to Survivor Series, the end came into sight. First, Kurt Angle defected to the Alliance. Don't ask. Then the Alliance and WWF agreed to a match at Survivor Series. If WWF won, the Alliance would disband. If the Alliance won, the WWF would go out of business. Now, I love a good stipulation match as much as the next man, but ones like this where it's never in doubt just take me out of it. Like tonight, it's Ric Flair versus JTG, and if Ric Flair loses, he'll be forced to retire. Or Steve Austin takes on the 2002 Manchester United squad, and if he loses, he gets dropped into a volcano. It's just pointless. Still, we were all in for Survivor Series. Now, at the show, the Alliance's major, huge #1 top star, Test, looked to combine his Intercontinental Championship with Edge's US Championship. But there was only room for one tall blonde Canadian in the WWF, and Edge walked away with the gold. Test would get his win later in the night by winning an Immunity Battle Royal. All the lower card guys of the WWF and the Alliance just scrapping it out, with the winner receiving immunity from getting fired depending on which side won. Yes, the implication was that if WWF went out of business, then every non-title holder would be fired, and vice versa should the Alliance lose. Just utterly mental. Oh look, there's DDP in there. What did Paige do to deserve such terrible treatment? And I know I said it before, but why the red carpet treatment for Test? The Dudleys defeated the Hardys to unify the WCW and WWF tag team titles in a spirited cage match, and Trish Stratus would win a six-pack challenge to lift the WWF Women's Championship. Now eyes down for a full house. It's main event time. The future of WWF, WCW and ECW hangs in the balance. On one side, the last bastion of the WWF, the People's Champion The Rock, Y2J Chris Jericho, the Phenom that is The Undertaker, the Big Red Machine Kane, and former WWF Champion The Big Show. And representing the Alliance, five-time WCW World Champion Booker T, ECW franchise player Rob Van Dam, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Kurt Angle, and Shane McMahon. It's just lazy and pathetic booking. As we've firmly established by now, the whole angle was poorly handled. But just on paper, nothing is more piss-take than the future of WCW and ECW being in the hands of WWF Stone Cold, Kurt Angle, and Shane pissing McMahon. And this was years before Shane O'Mac's mega push as the hardest man in WWE history. Obviously, the match all boiled down to the final four of Jericho, Rock, Angle, and Austin. Jericho was eliminated, Angle was eliminated, and we were down to Austin Rock. Again, which would have happened regardless of whether WWF bought out WCW and ECW or not. And just when it looked like it was all done and dusted for WWF, Kurt Angle turned face and blasted Austin with the WWF title, giving The Rock, and inevitably and more importantly the WWF, the win. Survivor Series then ended with The Rock and Vince McMahon celebrating water under the proverbial bridge. Right, so we've covered a lot of ground there, I know. For most feuds, there are several clear story beats and matches, but with the Invasion being a company-wide feud that dominated all TV for several months, there was simply too much to try and take on board. Partly a reason why it failed, and why it was likely always doomed to fail. So what was the fallout of the Invasion's end? Well, the very next night on Raw, Paul Heyman was fired and beaten up by Jim Ross. Seriously, as Jerry Lawler returned, Shane and Stephanie were given their marching orders, and the status quo was restored as Vince and Kurt Angle turned heel, purely because they celebrated victory too much. Steve Austin would turn face after aligning with the new co-owner of Raw, Ric Flair. Yes, the greatest name in WCW history, Ric Flair, made his WWF return the night after the Invasion ended. I've got no words. Raw and SmackDown would then have the first ever brand split, and you can easily see that at some time in the planning this would have been what WWF's plans for themselves and WCW would have been. A full roster split between the two companies. Now, not to go all armchair fantasy booker, but surely with a little time and patience, this could have worked out better. Have Shane still buy out WCW and put it on the back burner and have little mentions of it on WWF TV. Then in late 2001, bring in Flair as the figurehead and president and keep Shane out of it. As 2002 came around, the Time Warner contracts would start expiring, meaning the likes of the NWO, Rey Mysterio, Scott Steiner, Goldberg & Co. would all start filtering into WWE. If Vince didn't want to buy out the contracts, then the smart money would have been to pay some of the other WCW stars to stay at home and train and recuperate, and then launch a full-on invasion in early 2002. Have Flair try and bring the likes of Benoit, Eddie, Jericho, and Big Show back over to WCW. Bring Booker and DDP with him. Then later bring in Goldberg, Ray, Kidman, etc. Have Mick Foley as his WWF counterpart. Maybe even run Flair versus Cactus at some point. Why not? And again, just have ECW turning up and attacking whomever got in their way, because that's just fun, isn't it? In 2002, we'd see Triple H return from injury, and we'd also see Shawn Michaels return for the first time since early 1998. Are you telling me that we couldn't have gotten DX versus the NWO, or a huge NWO featuring the Game and the Heartbreak Kid? A little patience and the invasion could have been exactly what we wanted. Let's just ignore the massive egos that would have come with the territory and the obvious problems with booking wins and losses when trying to keep everyone happy. The quality of the matches wasn't what made this feud bad. It was the storytelling, and the storytelling alone. We knew that to the victor go the spoils, but Vince McMahon's immense ego was a big middle finger to not only the fans of WCW and ECW, but also to those who worked for both companies during their run. It's also said that WWF's one-sided booking and the treatment of DDP caused Sting to go, no thank you, whilst Eric Bischoff claims he was in discussions to come in during the invasion, but would also wait until 2002 before rearing his head in a WWF setting. To this day, the invasions still make fans groan, and while there have certainly been feuds that have been far worse, none have been as high profile as WWF versus WCW and ECW. It was literally the biggest feud of all time, on paper, and the way WWF handled it was nothing short of a monumental cock-up. If they played their cards right, their hot streak could have extended for another year or so at the very least, but alas. But WWE are seemingly not learning from mistakes of the past. We're seeing Invasion 2.0 in real time with WWE's NXT versus TNA, and even though it's more of a symbiotic relationship and not as overwhelmingly one-sided, it's still clear who the stars are, right Triple H? It seems history is always doomed to repeat itself, and we're just here for the ride.